The blood splattered across the arena dirt like crimson rain under the blazing floodlights of the San Antonio Stock Show and Rodeo. Luke Palmer's body lay motionless in the center of the ring, his protective vest torn open like paper, revealing the devastating wound that would claim the life of one of Texas's most beloved bull riders. The crowd of 47,000 fell into a silence so profound that the only sound echoing through the Alamodome was the heavy breathing of Tornado Alley, the massive black bull that had just delivered what would become the most talked-about ride in rodeo history. Just 8 seconds earlier, Luke had been living his dream. The 34-year-old veteran had climbed onto the back of the 2,000-pound beast with the same confidence that had carried him through 17 years of professional bull riding. His calloused hands gripped the rope with practiced precision, his body finding that perfect balance between control and chaos that separated champions from casualties. The gate swung open, and for a brief, shining moment, Luke Palmer was exactly where he belonged, dancing with death itself. But Tornado Alley had other plans. The bull's reputation preceded him like a dark legend whispered in rodeo circles across the country. Standing 6 feet at the shoulder with horns that curved like deadly scimitars, he had ended more careers than any other bull in the professional bull riders circuit. Tornado Alley didn't just buck riders off. He hunted them down with the calculated fury of a predator who understood that his job wasn't finished until his opponent was broken. The first 3 seconds of the ride unfolded like poetry in motion. Luke's body moved in perfect harmony with the bull's violent gyrations, his free arm cutting through the air like a conductor's baton orchestrating a symphony of controlled chaos. The crowd roared their approval as man and beast engaged in their primal dance, neither giving ground in the battle that had captivated audiences since the first cowboy decided to climb onto the back of an angry bull. Then everything changed in the space of a heartbeat. Tornado Alley executed a move that defied the laws of physics, a spinning leap that sent both rider and bull sailing through the air in a twisted embrace of violence and grace. Luke felt his grip slipping, felt the familiar sensation of weightlessness that every bull rider knows signals the end of a ride. But as he prepared for the controlled fall that had become second nature after thousands of rides, Tornado Alley twisted in midair with the precision of a guided missile. The bull's horn found its target with surgical accuracy, punching through Luke's protective vest and penetrating deep into his chest cavity. The impact sent shockwaves through the arena as the sickening sound of horn meeting flesh echoed through the suddenly silent dome. Luke's body crumpled to the dirt like a broken marionette, his life's blood beginning its fatal journey from his torn chest to the thirsty earth below. Dr. Sarah Martinez was already running before Luke hit the ground. As the rodeo's chief medical officer, she had seen her share of injuries, broken bones, concussions, and the occasional puncture wound that came with the territory. But the moment she saw the trajectory of Tornado Alley's horn, she knew this was different. This was the nightmare scenario that haunted every medical professional who worked in the world of professional bull riding. "Get the trauma kit and prep for immediate transport," she shouted to her team as she sprinted across the arena, her medical bag bouncing against her hip with each stride. The bullfighters were already moving Tornado Alley away from Luke's motionless form, their colorful outfits a stark contrast to the crimson spreading beneath the fallen rider. Luke's eyes were still open when Dr. Martinez reached him, though the light behind them was already beginning to dim. Blood frothed at the corners of his mouth, a clear sign that the horn had found something vital in his chest cavity. His protective vest, designed to withstand incredible amounts of impact, had been penetrated as easily as if it were made of tissue paper. "Stay with me, Luke," Dr. Martinez whispered as she began her assessment, her trained hands working quickly to assess the extent of the damage. But even as she spoke the words, she could see the truth written in the pallor of his skin and the rapid, shallow breathing that indicated massive internal bleeding. The horn had found his heart. In the stands, Luke's wife Jessica Palmer felt her world collapse in real time. She had been married to bull riding for 12 years, had watched her husband face death 8 seconds at a time for over a decade. She knew the risks, had made peace with the possibility that one day she might watch the sport she had learned to love claim the man she couldn't live without. But knowing something intellectually and experiencing it emotionally were two entirely different universes of pain. "Daddy!" The small voice belonged to 8-year-old Emma Palmer, Luke's daughter who had been watching from the family section with the wide-eyed wonder of a child who believed her father was invincible. Jessica gathered the little girl into her arms, trying to shield her from the horror unfolding in the arena below while her own heart shattered into a million pieces. The paramedics arrived within 90 seconds of the impact, their movements swift and professional as they transferred Luke from Dr. Martinez's care to their advanced life support equipment. But even their most sophisticated medical technology couldn't replace the blood that was flowing freely from the massive puncture wound in his chest. Luke Palmer was dying, and everyone in that arena knew it. As the ambulance raced through the streets of San Antonio toward University Hospital, its sirens wailing like a mechanical banshee, Luke drifted in and out of consciousness. In his lucid moments, his mind wandered back to the beginning, to the first time he had climbed onto the back of a bull at a small-town rodeo in rural Texas, when he was just 17 years old and convinced he was immortal. The emergency room at University Hospital exploded into controlled chaos as Luke's trauma team prepared for his arrival. Dr. James Harrison, the hospital's chief trauma surgeon, had performed thousands of life-saving procedures over his 20-year career, but he had never seen a case quite like this one. The preliminary reports from the paramedics painted a grim picture. Massive chest trauma, probable cardiac involvement, and blood loss that was approaching the point of no return. ETA 2 minutes. The radio crackled as the ambulance screamed through the final intersection before the hospital. Dr. Harrison looked around at his team, nurses, technicians, and specialists who had seen every conceivable type of trauma that the human body could endure. Tonight, they would be asked to perform a miracle. But some wounds are simply too deep for miracles. Luke Palmer was pronounced dead at 9:47 p.m., just 33 minutes after Tornado Alley's horn had found its mark. The official cause of death was listed as massive hemorrhaging due to penetrating cardiac trauma. Clinical language that couldn't begin to capture the magnitude of what had been lost when one of rodeo's greatest champions drew his final breath on a hospital gurney in San Antonio, Texas. The news spread through the rodeo community like wildfire, carried by text messages, phone calls, and social media posts that tried to make sense of the senseless. Luke Palmer wasn't just another bull rider. He was a champion, a mentor, and a symbol of everything that made the sport both beautiful and terrifying. His death would send shockwaves through a community that prided itself on toughness and resilience, forcing everyone who loved bull riding to confront the harsh reality that sometimes, even the best don't make it home. To understand the magnitude of what died in that San Antonio arena, you have to go back to the beginning, to a dusty ranch outside of Amarillo, Texas, where a 7-year-old Luke Palmer first laid eyes on a bull and decided he wanted to ride one. It was 1997, and the Palmer family had gathered for their annual reunion at Uncle Jim's Spread, a modest cattle operation that had been in the family for 3 generations. Luke's father, Robert Palmer, had worked construction his entire life, building the highways and office buildings that connected and defined modern Texas. His hands were permanently stained with concrete dust and motor oil, and his back carried the accumulated aches of 30 years spent bending, lifting, and laboring under the relentless Texas sun. Robert had dreams of something different for his son, college, maybe, or a desk job that wouldn't destroy his body piece by piece. But Luke had other ideas. The moment he saw his cousin Jake climb onto the back of a practice bull in Uncle Jim's makeshift arena, something ignited in the boy's chest that would burn for the rest of his life. It wasn't just the excitement or the danger, though both of those elements called to him like sirens. It was something deeper, more primal. It was the recognition that this was what he was meant to do, what he had been born for. "I want to try," Luke announced with the absolute certainty that only children possess. The adults laughed at first, charmed by the determination in his small voice. But when Luke continued to pester them throughout the afternoon, Uncle Jim finally relented and agreed to let the boy sit on the back of Buttercup, the gentlest bull on the ranch. Buttercup was hardly the stuff of rodeo legend. At 14 years old, she was more interested in finding shade and grass than in launching riders into orbit. But for 7-year-old Luke Palmer, she might as well have been the most dangerous bull in the world. As he settled onto her broad back, his small hands gripping the rope that Uncle Jim had rigged up for him, Luke felt a sense of completeness that he had never experienced before. When Buttercup finally decided to move, executing a lazy buck that barely qualified as movement, Luke stayed centered and balanced with an instinct that shocked the adults watching. Most kids his age would have been thrown immediately, but Luke seemed to anticipate the bull's movements before they happened, flowing with her motion like he had been born on her back. "Well, I'll be damned," Uncle Jim muttered under his breath, recognizing something in his young nephew that went beyond natural ability. This was calling pure and simple. That first ride lasted maybe 10 seconds, and when Luke finally slid off Buttercup's back, His face was radiant with a joy so pure it was almost painful to witness. Robert Palmer looked at his son and saw his own dreams for the boy's future crumbling like old concrete. But he also saw something he couldn't deny. His son had found his purpose at 7 years old, and fighting it would be like trying to hold back the tide. The drive home from Uncle Jim's ranch was filled with excited chatter from Luke about bulls and riding and 8-second buzzes. Robert listened to his son's enthusiasm with a mixture of pride and terror, knowing that he was looking at the beginning of a journey that would define not just Luke's life, but the entire Palmer family's existence. 6 months later, Luke entered his first junior rodeo competition in Lubbock. At 8 years old, he was competing against boys who had been riding since they could walk, but his natural ability and fearless approach to the sport quickly made him a standout. His first official ride on a real bucking bull lasted the full 8 seconds, and when the buzzer sounded, Luke raised his free arm in triumph like he had been doing it his entire life. That was the beginning of a legend in the making. Throughout his teenage years, Luke dominated the junior bull riding circuit across Texas and the surrounding states. He won his first major championship at 13, defeating riders who were 3 and 4 years older with a style that combined technical precision with an almost supernatural ability to read a bull's movements. Coaches and fellow riders started to take notice of the kid from Amarillo who rode like he had been born in the saddle. But success in junior rodeo didn't automatically translate to financial stability. The Palmer family struggled to fund Luke's competition schedule, often driving hundreds of miles in their beat-up Chevy pickup to reach events where the entry fees alone could wipe out a week's worth of grocery money. Robert picked up extra construction jobs whenever possible, and Luke's mother, Maria, took on additional shifts at the diner where she worked, all to keep their son's dream alive. Luke never forgot those sacrifices. Years later, when he was earning 6 figures on the professional circuit, he would look back on those lean years as the foundation of everything he accomplished. The memory of his parents' quiet determination to support his dreams, even when it meant going without themselves, would drive him to excellence long after he had proven himself as one of the sport's elite riders. At 17, Luke made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He turned professional. The transition from junior to professional bull riding was like jumping from Little League to the major leagues overnight. Suddenly, Luke was facing bulls that weighed twice as much as anything he had ridden before. Animals bred specifically for their ability to launch riders into the stratosphere with bone-crushing force. His first professional ride was at a small-town rodeo in Oklahoma, and it lasted exactly 2.5 seconds before a bull named Earthquake sent him flying into the arena fence with enough force to crack 2 ribs. As Luke lay on the ground, gasping for breath and tasting blood, he had his first real moment of doubt about his chosen profession. But doubt was a luxury Luke Palmer couldn't afford. He had invested too much of himself and his family's resources to quit now. So he climbed back onto the next bull, and the one after that, slowly building the reputation and skills that would carry him to the top of his profession. The breakthrough came during his 3rd professional season, when Luke drew a bull named Thunder Road at the Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo. Thunder Road was a legend in his own right, a massive gray bull with a reputation for never having been ridden for the full 8 seconds. Most riders considered drawing Thunder Road to be the equivalent of a death sentence with horns. But Luke saw something different when he looked at Thunder Road. Where other riders saw chaos and unpredictability, Luke saw patterns and opportunities. He studied video of the bull's previous rides obsessively, mapping out the animal's tendencies and preferences like a chess master analyzing an opponent's strategy. When the gate opened and Thunder Road exploded into the arena like a gray tornado, Luke was ready. For 8 seconds that felt like 8 hours, man and bull engaged in a battle of wills that had the crowd on its feet screaming. Thunder Road threw everything he had at the young rider, spinning, jumping, and twisting with the fury of a natural disaster made flesh. But Luke stayed centered, his body moving with the bull's violence like he was part of the animal itself. When the buzzer sounded, marking the completion of the first successful ride on Thunder Road in the bull's 5-year professional career, Luke dismounted and walked away with a score of 94 points, the highest individual ride score recorded that season. That ride changed everything. Suddenly, Luke Palmer wasn't just another young rider trying to make his mark. He was the kid who had conquered the unconquerable, the one who had solved the puzzle that had stumped every other rider in the sport. Sponsorship offers started pouring in, along with invitations to compete at the sport's premier events. Over the next 15 years, Luke built a career that most riders could only dream of. He won 3 professional bull riders' world championships, earned over $2 million in prize money, and became one of the most recognizable faces in all of professional rodeo. But more than his individual achievements, Luke became known as a mentor and role model for younger riders, always willing to share his knowledge and experience with anyone who asked. He married Jessica Martinez in 2009, a veterinarian he met at a rodeo in Fort Worth, where she was providing medical care for the animals. Their wedding was a who's who of the bull riding world, with champions and legends gathering to celebrate one of their own finding happiness outside the arena. When their daughter Emma was born in 2012, Luke often said it was the only 8 seconds of his life that mattered more than any he had spent on the back of a bull. But through all the success and accolades, Luke never lost sight of where he came from or what the sport had given him. He established the Palmer Foundation in 2015, providing scholarships and equipment to young riders from low-income families who showed promise but lacked the financial resources to pursue their dreams. Every year, the foundation helped dozens of kids experience the same opportunities that Luke had fought so hard to create for himself. As he approached his mid-30s, Luke began to contemplate retirement. His body bore the accumulated damage of nearly 2 decades of professional bull riding. 3 concussions, 2 broken arms, a shattered collarbone, and more bruises and muscle strains than he could count. Jessica had been gently encouraging him to step away from competition and focus on their family and his growing business interests. But Luke wasn't ready to walk away just yet. He felt like he had at least one more championship run left in him, one final opportunity to prove that experience and wisdom could still triumph over youth and raw talent. The San Antonio Stock Show and Rodeo represented the perfect stage for what he hoped would be a triumphant return to form after a disappointing previous season. As he prepared for what would become his final ride, Luke reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. From that first ride on Buttercup at Uncle Jim's ranch to the bright lights and roaring crowds of the Alamodome, his life had been a testament to the power of dreams and determination. He had lived more in his 34 years than most people experienced in twice that time. If he had known that Tornado Alley was waiting for him in that final shoot, would Luke Palmer have made different choices? Would he have walked away from the sport that had defined his existence, chosen safety over glory, family over fame? Those who knew him best say the answer is simple. Luke Palmer would have climbed onto that bull anyway. Because that's who he was, a man who faced his fears 8 seconds at a time, who turned danger into art, and who never backed down from a challenge, no matter how steep the odds against him. The news of Luke Palmer's death hit the rodeo community like a lightning strike on a clear day, sudden, devastating, and impossible to ignore. Within hours of the official announcement, tributes began pouring in from across the country and around the world. Fellow riders, fans, and industry leaders struggled to find words adequate to capture the magnitude of what had been lost when Tornado Alley's horn found its mark in that San Antonio arena. Professional Bull Riders CEO Sean Gleason was in his Denver office when his phone began buzzing with calls from reporters and industry insiders. At first, he hoped the reports were exaggerated. Maybe Luke was seriously injured, maybe in critical condition, but surely not dead. Champions like Luke Palmer didn't just die at the height of their careers. They retired to their ranches, became commentators, or started their own rodeo companies. They didn't get carried out of arenas in body bags. But as the details became clear, Gleason found himself faced with a crisis that went far beyond the loss of one competitor, no matter how beloved. Luke Palmer's death threatened to reignite the ongoing debate about safety in professional bull riding, a conversation that had been simmering beneath the surface of the sport for years, but had never reached the boiling point that it was about to achieve. The first call came from ESPN, then Fox Sports, then CNN. By midnight, every major news outlet in the country was running stories about the tragic death of bull riding champion Luke Palmer. The coverage wasn't just confined to sports pages. This was front-page news, the kind of story that transcended sports and became a cultural phenomenon. Dr. Michael Thompson, a sports medicine specialist who had been advocating for improved safety protocols in rodeo for over a decade, watched the coverage with a mixture of sadness and frustration. He had known Luke personally, had treated him for various injuries over the years, and had warned repeatedly that the sport's emphasis on tradition and toughness was preventing the adoption of safety measures that could save lives. This was completely preventable, Dr. Thompson told a reporter from the Dallas Morning News. We have the technology and knowledge to dramatically reduce the risk of fatal injuries in bull riding, but the sport has been resistant to meaningful change. Luke Palmer died because we prioritize spectacle over safety, and that's a choice we make every time we send a rider into that arena. The criticism stung because it contained more than a grain of truth. Professional bull riding had indeed been slow to adopt some of the safety innovations that had become standard in other high-risk sports. While protective vests had become mandatory in the 1990s, other potential life-saving measures, including improved arena design, enhanced medical protocols, and even more advanced protective gear, had been met with resistance from traditionalists who argued that such changes would fundamentally alter the nature of the sport. But not everyone in the rodeo community agreed with Dr. Thompson's assessment. Three-time world champion Cody Martinez, who had competed against Luke for over a decade, fired back in an interview with Fox Sports Radio. Luke Palmer knew the risks better than anyone, Martinez said, his voice thick with emotion. He wasn't some naive kid who stumbled into this sport by accident. He was a professional who understood exactly what he was signing up for every time he climbed onto a bull. To suggest that his death was the result of negligence by the sport is an insult to his memory and his choice to live life on his own terms. The debate raged across social media, sports talk radio, and cable news programs. Hashtags like #RodeoSafety and #RememberLuke began trending on Twitter, while Facebook groups dedicated to bull riding were flooded with passionate arguments from both sides of the safety debate. The sport that had always prided itself on being a close-knit community suddenly found itself divided by fundamental questions about risk, responsibility, and the price of entertainment. In Amarillo, Luke's parents found themselves at the center of a media storm they never could have imagined. Robert Palmer, the construction worker who had sacrificed so much to support his son's dreams, struggled to process the reality that those same dreams had ultimately claimed Luke's life. The man who had taught his son to face challenges head-on was now faced with a challenge of his own: how to grieve publicly while the entire world watched. Luke lived more in 34 years than most people do in 80, Robert told a reporter from the Amarillo Globe News, his voice barely above a whisper. He followed his passion, he provided for his family, and he made a difference in people's lives. I can't say I would change anything he did, even knowing how it ended. That wouldn't be fair to the man he was, or the life he chose to live. Maria Palmer, Luke's mother, was less philosophical in her response to her son's death. The woman who had worked double shifts at a diner to fund Luke's early competition expenses now found herself questioning whether all those sacrifices had been worth the ultimate price. I keep thinking about all the times I could have said no, she confessed to a close friend. All the times I could have told him it was too dangerous, that he needed to find something safer to do with his life. But I didn't because I could see how happy it made him. Now I wonder if that happiness was worth losing him over. The funeral arrangements became a logistical nightmare as the Palmer family tried to balance their desire for privacy with the public's overwhelming desire to pay their respects to a fallen champion. Eventually, they settled on a public memorial service at the Amarillo Civic Center, followed by a private burial for family and close friends. The memorial service drew over 5,000 people, including current and former bull riders, industry executives, politicians, and fans who had traveled from across the country to say goodbye to their hero. The service was broadcast live on ESPN and the Cowboy Channel, reaching hundreds of thousands more viewers who wanted to be part of the collective grieving process. Jessica Palmer delivered a eulogy that left hardly a dry eye in the building. Standing at the podium with 8-year-old Emma beside her, she spoke about the man behind the legend, the husband who made her coffee every morning, the father who never missed a bedtime story, the friend who would drop everything to help someone in need. Luke always said that bull riding was what he did, not who he was, Jessica said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. He was a husband, a father, a son, and a friend before he was ever a champion. Those 8 seconds in the arena were just the smallest part of a life that was full of love, laughter, and purpose. That's what I want people to remember about my husband, not how he died, but how he lived. The eulogy was followed by tributes from fellow riders, including an emotional speech by Jake Morrison, Luke's longtime rival and closest friend in the sport. Morrison had competed against Luke for over a decade, and their rivalry had pushed both men to achieve heights neither might have reached alone. Luke Palmer made everyone around him better, Morrison said, struggling to maintain his composure. He made me a better rider because I knew I had to bring my absolute best every time we competed against each other. But more than that, he made me a better man. He showed all of us what it meant to be a champion not just in the arena, but in life. The sport will never be the same without him. The impact of Luke's death extended far beyond the rodeo community. Major sponsors began asking tough questions about their involvement in a sport that could produce such tragic outcomes. Several companies quietly pulled their advertising from bull riding events, while others demanded enhanced safety protocols as a condition of continued sponsorship. The Professional Bull Riders Organization found itself under intense scrutiny from regulatory bodies, insurance companies, and politicians who suddenly took an interest in the safety of a sport they had previously ignored. Congressional hearings were scheduled to examine whether federal oversight was needed for professional rodeo, while state legislators in Texas and other rodeo-heavy states began drafting bills that would mandate specific safety requirements for professional bull riding events. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the rodeo's chief medical officer who had been the first to reach Luke after his fatal injury, found herself testifying before a Senate subcommittee about safety protocols in professional rodeo. The experience was surreal, sitting in a wood-paneled hearing room in Washington, D.C., being questioned by senators who clearly knew very little about bull riding but were determined to appear proactive in the face of public concern. Could Luke Palmer's death have been prevented? Asked Senator Patricia Williams of California, her voice carrying the prosecutorial tone of someone who already knew the answer she wanted to hear. Dr. Martinez considered the question carefully before responding. Senator, Luke Palmer was wearing the most advanced protective equipment available to bull riders today. He was competing under medical supervision by trained professionals who responded to his injury within seconds. The tragic reality is that when you put a human being in close proximity to a 2,000-pound animal with horns, there will always be risks that cannot be completely eliminated. But surely there are additional safety measures that could be implemented, Senator Williams pressed. Mandatory helmet requirements, improved protective gear, better arena designs? All of those things are being actively discussed within the sport, Dr. Martinez replied. But it's important to understand that bull riding, by its very nature, involves calculated risks that the participants willingly accept. Luke Palmer wasn't a victim. He was a professional athlete who understood the dangers inherent in his chosen sport and accepted them as part of what made his accomplishments meaningful. The hearing generated more questions than answers, but it did succeed in keeping Luke's death in the national spotlight long after the initial news cycle had moved on to other stories. The sustained attention created pressure for change within the rodeo community, even as many traditionalists pushed back against what they saw as knee-jerk reactions to a tragic but isolated incident. Perhaps the most significant impact of Luke's death was on the young riders who looked up to him as a role model and mentor. Suddenly, the sport that had represented freedom, excitement, and opportunity took on a darker cast. Parents who had previously supported their children's rodeo dreams began having second thoughts, while young riders themselves grappled with the realization that their hero's fate could just as easily become their own. Tommy Rodriguez was 16 years old and considered one of the most promising young bull riders in Texas when Luke Palmer died. Tommy had attended several of Luke's riding clinics and considered the champion to be his personal hero. The news of Luke's death hit Tommy like a physical blow, forcing him to confront the mortality that he had never seriously considered before. "I always knew bull riding was dangerous," Tommy confided to his father after Luke's funeral. "But I never really thought about what that meant until now. Luke was supposed to be invincible. If it could happen to him, it could happen to anybody." Tommy's father, Miguel Rodriguez, found himself in the same position as thousands of other rodeo parents across the country, trying to balance his son's dreams against the very real dangers that Luke's death had brought into sharp focus. The conversation between father and son stretched late into the night, touching on risk, reward, passion, and the price of pursuing excellence in a sport that demanded everything from its participants. "Your mother and I will support whatever decision you make," Miguel finally told his son. "But you need to understand that this isn't a game anymore. Luke Palmer's death isn't just a tragedy. It's a wake-up call for everyone involved in this sport. If you decide to keep riding, you need to do it with your eyes wide open about what you're risking every time you climb onto a bull." The ripple effects of Luke Palmer's death would continue to spread through the rodeo community for years to come, touching lives and changing perspectives in ways both large and small. Safety protocols that had been discussed for years suddenly became urgent priorities. Young riders who had never seriously considered the risks of their sport found themselves making difficult decisions about their futures. And a community that had always prided itself on its toughness and resilience discovered that even the strongest foundations could be shaken by the loss of one of their brightest stars. But perhaps the most important impact of Luke's death was the conversation it started about what it truly means to live life on your own terms. In a world increasingly focused on safety and security, Luke Palmer had chosen a path that prioritized passion over protection, dreams over guarantees. His death raised uncomfortable questions about whether such choices were admirable or reckless, heroic or selfish. As the initial shock of Luke's death began to give way to a more measured examination of his life and legacy, one thing became clear. Luke Palmer had lived exactly the life he chose to live, with all its risks and rewards. Whether that choice was worth the ultimate price he paid remained a question that each person would have to answer for themselves. 6 months after Luke Palmer's death, the Professional Bull Riders Organization convened in Las Vegas for its annual awards banquet, an event that typically celebrated the year's champions and looked ahead to the upcoming season. But this year's gathering carried a weight that no one in attendance could ignore. Luke's absence was palpable, a void that seemed to echo through every speech, every tribute, and every moment of silence. The sport had changed in the wake of Luke's death, though not always in ways that everyone anticipated. The immediate calls for dramatic safety overhauls had given way to a more nuanced conversation about risk, responsibility, and the fundamental nature of bull riding itself. Some changes had been implemented: enhanced medical protocols, improved protective equipment standards, and more rigorous arena safety inspections. But the sport's essential character remained intact, a testament to the community's determination to honor Luke's memory without abandoning the principles he had died defending. Jessica Palmer sat at the head table, wearing a black dress that somehow managed to be both elegant and somber. Beside her, 8-year-old Emma fidgeted with a small wooden bull that her father had carved for her years earlier, when she was too young to understand the danger inherent in the sport that had defined their family's life. The Palmer Foundation had grown exponentially since Luke's death, fueled by donations from across the rodeo community and beyond. What had started as a modest scholarship program had evolved into a comprehensive support system for young riders and their families. Luke always believed that talent and determination should matter more than a family's financial situation, Jessica said as she accepted the organization's first-ever legacy award on her husband's behalf. He grew up watching his parents sacrifice everything to support his dreams, and he never forgot what that meant. The foundation isn't just about money. It's about giving kids the same opportunities that Luke had, regardless of where they come from or how much their families can afford to invest in their dreams. The award was a surprise addition to the evening's program, created specifically to honor Luke's contributions to the sport both as a competitor and as a mentor to younger riders. But more than that, it represented the organization's attempt to channel the grief and energy surrounding Luke's death into something positive and lasting. Among the scholarship recipients that evening was Tommy Rodriguez, the 16-year-old from Texas who had struggled with his decision to continue riding after Luke's death. Tommy had ultimately chosen to stay in the sport, but with a new appreciation for both its risks and its rewards. His acceptance speech carried a maturity that seemed far beyond his years. "Luke Palmer taught me that being a champion isn't just about winning," Tommy said, his voice steady despite the obvious emotion behind his words. "It's about how you carry yourself, how you treat other people, and how you use your success to lift up others. I can't promise that I'll be as good a rider as Luke was, but I can promise that I'll try to be as good a person as he was." The speech drew a standing ovation that lasted nearly 5 minutes, led by the veteran riders who had competed alongside Luke for over a decade. It was a moment that captured something essential about the rodeo community's response to tragedy: the determination to honor the fallen by living up to the standards they had set, rather than simply mourning their loss. Dr. Sarah Martinez had left her position as the rodeo's chief medical officer 3 months after Luke's death, unable to reconcile her passion for the sport with the trauma of losing someone she had tried desperately to save. She had returned to her previous role as an emergency room physician at a Houston hospital, where the injuries she treated were random accidents rather than the calculated risks taken by athletes who chose to dance with death for a living. But she couldn't stay away completely. Martinez had become one of the leading advocates for improved safety protocols in professional rodeo, working with equipment manufacturers to develop better protective gear, and consulting with event organizers on medical response procedures. Her expertise carried special weight, because it came from someone who had lived through the nightmare scenario that every medical professional in rodeo feared most. Luke's death wasn't the result of negligence or inadequate medical care, Martinez explained to a gathering of sports medicine specialists in Atlanta. It was the tragic confluence of circumstances that can occur when human beings engage with powerful animals in a competitive environment. But that doesn't mean we should accept such outcomes as inevitable. Every life saved by improved safety protocols, every serious injury prevented by better equipment, honors Luke's memory in the most meaningful way possible. The equipment manufacturers had indeed responded to Luke's death with renewed efforts to improve protective gear. The vest that Luke had been wearing when Tornado Alley's horn found its mark had been redesigned with additional protection around the chest area, though some riders complained that the enhanced safety came at the cost of mobility and comfort. It was the eternal trade-off in any dangerous sport: safety versus performance, protection versus the freedom of movement that could mean the difference between a successful ride and a devastating fall. Tornado Alley, the bull responsible for Luke's death, had been retired from competition immediately after the fatal incident. The decision sparked controversy within the rodeo community, with some arguing that retiring a bull for doing what bulls were bred to do set a dangerous precedent. But the bull's owner, veteran stock contractor Bill Morrison, felt that continuing to use Tornado Alley would be disrespectful to Luke's memory and traumatic for the riders who would have to face him. "That bull did nothing wrong," Morrison explained to a reporter from Western Horseman magazine. "He was just being a bull, doing what bulls do. But sometimes there are things more important than business, more important than competition." Luke Palmer was a friend, and I couldn't stomach the idea of that bull competing again knowing what he had done, even if it was just an accident. Tornado Alley was retired to a ranch in Montana, where he would live out his days in peaceful pastures far from the bright lights and roaring crowds of professional rodeo. It was a small gesture, perhaps, but one that resonated throughout the rodeo community as a sign of respect for a fallen champion. The impact of Luke's death extended far beyond the rodeo arena. His story had captured the attention of Hollywood, leading to the development of a biographical film that would tell the story of his rise from a small-town Texas kid to a world champion bull rider. The project faced the challenge of honoring Luke's memory while accurately depicting the dangers of the sport that had claimed his life. Jessica Palmer had been heavily involved in the film's development, serving as a consultant to ensure that Luke's character was portrayed accurately and respectfully. The process of reliving her husband's life through the lens of Hollywood producers and screenwriters had been both therapeutic and painful, forcing her to examine aspects of their relationship that she had never fully understood while he was alive. "Luke used to say that bull riding was the most honest thing he had ever done," Jessica reflected during a break in filming. "There was no pretending in that arena, no hiding behind anything except your own skill and courage. The bull either bucked you off or he didn't. You either lasted 8 seconds, or you didn't. Everything else in life was complicated, but those 8 seconds were pure truth." The film, tentatively titled 8 Seconds to Glory, was scheduled for release 2 years after Luke's death, timed to coincide with the anniversary of his final ride. Early screenings had generated positive reviews, with critics praising the movie's unflinching portrayal of both the beauty and brutality of professional bull riding. But perhaps the most significant development in the year following Luke's death was the emergence of a new generation of safety-conscious riders who refused to accept that fatal injuries were simply the price of doing business in professional rodeo. These young riders, many of whom had been inspired by Luke's example, were pushing for changes that went beyond improved equipment to encompass fundamental reforms in how the sport approached risk management. Marcus Thompson, a 22-year-old rider from Oklahoma who had won his first major championship just months after Luke's death, became the unofficial spokesman for this new generation. Thompson had been one of Luke's protégés, attending his riding schools and seeking his advice on everything from technique to career management. "Luke taught us to be fearless in the arena, but he also taught us to be smart," Thompson said in an interview with ESPN. "He never took unnecessary risks, never let his ego override his judgment. The riders who think that safety improvements somehow make the sport less authentic don't understand what Luke was really about. He was about excellence, not recklessness." Thompson's advocacy for safety improvements had earned him both praise and criticism within the rodeo community. Some veteran riders accused him of trying to sanitize a sport that had always prided itself on its raw, uncompromising nature. But Thompson remained undeterred, arguing that Luke's death had proven that even the most skilled and experienced riders could fall victim to the sport's inherent dangers. The debate came to a head during a contentious meeting of the Professional Bull Riders Board of Directors, where proposed safety regulations were debated with an intensity that reflected the deep divisions within the sport. On one side were the traditionalists who argued that excessive safety measures would fundamentally alter the character of bull riding. On the other were the reformers who insisted that honoring Luke's memory required making the sport as safe as possible for future generations of riders. The compromise that eventually emerged satisfied no one completely, but moved the sport incrementally toward enhanced safety protocols. New regulations mandated improved protective equipment, enhanced medical staffing at events, and stricter standards for bull selection and arena design. It wasn't the dramatic overhaul that some had demanded, but it represented meaningful progress in a sport that had historically been resistant to change. Emma Palmer, now 9 years old, had been attending riding lessons at a local stable near her home in San Antonio. Her mother had initially been horrified at the idea of her daughter pursuing any form of rodeo activity, but Emma's determination reminded Jessica so much of Luke that she eventually relented. The lessons were focused on basic horsemanship rather than bull riding, but they provided Emma with a connection to her father's world that seemed to bring her comfort in the difficult months following his death. "Daddy would have wanted me to learn to ride," Emma insisted during one of their conversations about the lessons. "He always said that understanding animals was the most important part of rodeo. He wasn't trying to fight the bulls, he was trying to dance with them." The wisdom in Emma's words struck Jessica with unexpected force. Perhaps that was Luke's true legacy. Not the championships he had won or the records he had set, but the understanding that authentic courage wasn't about the absence of fear, but about dancing with danger in pursuit of something greater than yourself. As the first anniversary of Luke's death approached, the rodeo community prepared for a series of memorial events that would celebrate his life and examine his impact on the sport. The centerpiece would be a special competition at the San Antonio Stock Show and Rodeo, held in the same arena where Luke had taken his final ride. The event would feature many of the sport's top riders competing for a prize fund donated entirely to the Palmer Foundation. But the real memorial to Luke Palmer wouldn't be found in any single event or ceremony. It would be found in the young riders who carried themselves with the dignity and professionalism that he had modeled, in the safety improvements that might prevent future tragedies, and in the ongoing conversation about what it means to pursue excellence in the face of genuine danger. Luke Palmer had lived his entire adult life 8 seconds at a time, finding meaning and purpose in those brief moments when man and beast engaged in their ancient dance of skill and will. His death had forced the rodeo community to confront uncomfortable truths about the price of that dance, but it had also reminded everyone involved why those 8 seconds mattered so much. In the end, Luke's legacy wasn't diminished by the manner of his death. It was defined by the fullness of his life and the impact he had on everyone who knew him. He had shown that it was possible to be both fierce competitor and gentle mentor, fearless athlete and devoted family man. He had proven that 8 seconds could contain a lifetime of meaning, if you lived them with purpose and passion. The bull riding community would continue to evolve in the wake of Luke Palmer's death, balancing respect for tradition with the necessity of progress. New safety measures would save lives, new generations of riders would push the sport to greater heights, and the conversation about risk and reward would continue as long as humans chose to climb onto the backs of bucking bulls. But through all the changes and challenges that lay ahead, one thing would remain constant: the memory of a champion who had lived exactly the life he chose to live, who had danced with danger 8 seconds at a time, and who had shown an entire sport what it meant to be truly fearless in the pursuit of excellence. Luke Palmer's final ride had lasted only 4 seconds, ending in tragedy that shocked the world and changed a sport forever. But his life's work, the example he set, the young riders he mentored, and the foundation he built, would continue long after the arena lights dimmed and the crowds went home. That perhaps was the greatest 8 seconds of all, the legacy that would outlast any championship, any record, any single moment of glory in the arena. Luke Palmer had achieved immortality not through his victories, but through the lives he had touched and the sport he had helped to shape. If that story already moved you, subscribe to the channel and leave your like to not miss any of our stories.